Hi everyone, welcome back to the Edgewater Avenue YouTube channel. Today we're continuing our elastic series. If you haven't already, I recommend watching part 1 before moving on to part 2, this video. It includes the 3 most commonly asked questions about swimwear elastic, and it also has some helpful tips for before you start sewing. And now in part 2, we're going to be going over questions and tips for while you sew. And then later on, I'm going to be doing a demo. So let's get going. First, we're going to pull up the questions you asked on Instagram and just go through those one by one. So first, do you stretch while sewing? And if so, what stretch percentage do you use? So I don't stretch at all while sewing. There is a good argument to stretch while you're sewing, and most non-reversibles do actually have a stretch percentage involved. But when it comes to reversibles, it's a different issue. For one, if you stretch the elastic while you're sewing, the finished garment isn't going to lay flat, which maybe you don't care whether or not it lays flat, maybe you care more about what it looks like on, and that's fine. But for aesthetic reasons, you don't see a lot of scrunched up, wrinkly swimsuits hanging on racks at stores. And another reason why I do not stretch is because I don't like the feeling of tight elastic. That's just personal preference though, so stretch if you want to. As far as the percentage of how much to stretch, it depends on the garment as well as the person wearing it. From what I've seen, a reduction from 2 to 3% is appropriate. So you'd measure the length of the seam, multiply it by 0.02, then subtract that number from the length of the seam, and that will get you the length of your elastic. The next question is, how much elastic do you need? It totally depends on the style. Sometimes I'm using 2 yards, sometimes I'm using 10 yards if it's something really strappy. It's good to keep at least 10 yards on hand, but if you sew a lot, then you'll definitely want a lot more than that. Edgewater Avenue's sister company, Swimwear Notions USA, we sell the elastic by the pound, and so I usually keep a 1 pound box stocked at all times. Next, does the stitch have to cover the elastic fully? From my knowledge, not necessarily. This is anecdotal, so I could be wrong on this, but from pieces that I've made and some that I've purchased, some of them will have the seam fully covered by the elastic and some won't. The ones that don't have the seam fully covered is usually because they're using thicker elastic, like 3/8. And those are fine. I don't really notice much of a difference. Sometimes you can see the elastic through depending on the fabric that's being used, but overall, I think it's fine. Again, this is just anecdotal evidence, so take it with a grain of salt. Does the elastic sit better on one side versus the other in a reversible? Yes, I found the elastic sits better on the dominant side, which will be whatever primary fabric you want. But honestly, in my reversibles, there's not even that much peeking over, even on the non-dominant side. Do you need to adjust tension when switching from sewing with versus without elastic? For some machines, yes. For some machines, no. My serger has automatic tension, so I'm never really messing with it unless I'm switching from something like swimwear fabric to cotton or fleece. But a lot of machines that have tension options will need you to tweak depending on whether or not you're using elastic. And not just that. Some machines need you to tweak going from one swimwear fabric to another swimwear fabric. It just depends on your machine. Some are more fussy than others. Where do you stop sewing elastic when you're approaching seams? This is a controversial question and many of you might not like my answer. Sew the elastic all the way to the end of the seam. I used to cut the elastic short or even taper it towards a seam. However, you can actually see that tapering. You can see where it's cut short in the finished garment. Plus, if the elastic falls short, it's not actually holding the tension that it's intended to on that seam. Instead, the part of the seam that doesn't have elastic on it, aka just the thread, is holding the rest of that tension, which is a big no-no, and that could definitely wear down on the seam over time. So I sew my elastic all the way to the edge and then I trim the excess. Cutting it short or tapering is a method of trying to prevent the bulk at the seam, but I just think that if you do a good job trimming, you don't need to do that. It doesn't get rid of the bulk 100%, but I think it does a pretty good job, and I think that it looks a lot better than having the elastic run short. So puncturing rubber elastic, how many times is too many? If you sew over rubber elastic once and you decide to go back and take it off, I recommend getting a fresh piece of elastic and not using the same one. The needle punctures will mess with the structural integrity of the rubber, so I just wouldn't mess with it. If you're just making pieces for yourself and you're just trying to conserve elastic, then maybe reuse it, but I personally wouldn't. I wouldn't take the risk that the elastic might break later on. Do you need an elastic foot? Not necessarily. I didn't have an elastic foot for years and I got by just fine. If you don't have an elastic foot, you'll just break up the process into 2 steps. First, you'll sew the fabric together and then you'll go and sew the elastic over. An elastic foot will make your life so much easier though. So if you want to learn more about the elastic foot, I did make a video on it, so make sure to check that out. Now we're gonna move on to the demo where we're gonna be answering some more questions as well as just showing you how it's done. So I'm first just gonna show you in real time how I sew elastic. So I'm using an elastic foot here. It's a fantastic tool. I will show you later on doing it without an elastic foot. The first thing I do is insert my elastic into the foot, pull it through, and I just have a scrap piece of fabric. I'm going to fold it and put this elastic on. So you're putting the fabric under the elastic, lowering the presser foot, and then you're ready to go. This is a 4-thread overlock stitch. So I'm using both needles as well as both loopers in my serger. So this is how it turned out. And what I usually do before I even put on elastic is I will take my piece, any piece that I'm doing, I'll first do a basting stitch. The basting stitch just helps keep everything in place. I talked about it in another video, which I will link. Now I'm going to answer some questions about how elastic is sewn. The first question is how to sew elastic flat. So the theory is that you want both even tension on your fabric as well as your elastic. And so if one of those is pulled even slightly, then it's going to produce an entirely different result. If you're using an elastic foot, it can be a lot easier to find the right tension. Also, you should not only pay attention to the fabric as it's going into the machine, but also going out of it. Even if you're doing everything right, there's a good chance that the problems you're having have to do more with your machine. The feed dogs are under the needle plate, and those are what feed everything through. So these are the feed dogs here, and these are what feed the fabric through. So watch. You can see how they're moving, and this is what brings the fabric from here all the way back through. However, those feed dogs don't always do what you want them to. In many cases, it's the feed dogs that are feeding the elastic or the fabric unevenly, faster or slower than you want it to. And I had this exact same problem before switching over to an elastic foot. So what really helped me was being very active in the process and using 2 hands. So I'd have one hand up here guiding the elastic, and my other hand would be back here and just gently pulling it through. It's not really necessary with an elastic foot, but if you're not using one, then it can be very helpful. But my best tip for sewing elastic flat is to use 2 hands, be actively involved in the process, and use a basting stitch where you can. Tips for sewing elastic onto straps. Straps can be incredibly difficult because they're so thin, so here are some tips. First, use a basting stitch. I just talked about it. Do a basting stitch. Have it sewn before so you can make sure that everything lines up, and then you can attach elastic, and then you only have to focus on the elastic and not fabric plus elastic. It makes it much easier. My second piece of advice is to leave extra seam allowance. Some machines will suck up fabric pretty easily, so leaving a little bit extra allowance can help prevent that. So if you use the same tips in the previous question of how to sew elastic flat, then that will definitely help. So I'm going to sew a strap. I'm not going to do a basting stitch. We're just going to wing it and see how it goes. So feed the elastic through. Feed the fabric through. You see how instinctively my hand immediately goes back here? That's because I want to guide it back out of the machine. I'm not pulling, I'm just making sure that everything is going through smoothly. I'm letting the machine do the work. If you try to do too much of the work, unless you're correcting for something, then you're probably going to run into problems. Again, unless you're correcting for something. So that strap is looking perfect. Be very active in the process, let the machine do the work, and don't give up. Practice makes perfect. You start to get a hand for things. So I've showed you how to apply with an elastic foot, and now we're gonna take this thing off and apply it without. So let me go find my regular foot. Going to put this thing on. Okay, so let's get another strap out. Like I said, a good tip for sewing straps without an elastic foot, or straps or anything, is just break the process into 2 steps. So I have my fabric, and I'm first just gonna focus on sewing that fabric together. So what I'm doing right now is a basting stitch. If you want, you can switch over to your regular sewing machine and do a long stitch length and just do a basting stitch instead. As I'm filming this, my sewing machine is stuffed away and I have my camera set up. So I'm just gonna use the overlock stitch. But something I am gonna do is increase my stitch length. So my stitch length is as long as possible. All right. So now we're gonna go and attach the elastic. So just like with the elastic foot, I'm going to put the elastic and the fabric in. I haven't done this in forever, but my muscle memory is telling me to put it in like this. So I have the fabric and the elastic on top of each other. Okay. Oh, I need to lower my stitch. bleh. I need to lower my stitch length, so I'm gonna go back down to, mine was at 2 on my baby lock. So what I'm noticing as I'm doing this and my muscle memory starting to kick in is I'm letting the fabric kind of slide off to the side, and then I have my elastic on the other side. And I'm not sure if that's even helpful, but watching it, like, it's kind of being guided in that way. The elastic is being guided by my finger and the fabric is being guided by the edge of the machine. I don't know, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. So I'm starting to notice that some of my elastic is curling. And so what I'm gonna do to counteract that is I'm gonna pull just a little bit harder back here. And by pull, I mean just the most gentle tug, like barely even touching it, but just enough. And that did seem to correct what was going on. Okay, so that finishes the strap without the elastic foot. Honestly, it's pretty good. That really shows that you don't need an elastic foot. However, the elastic foot was much faster and much more consistent. There are definitely some times in here where I strayed from the stitch line and maybe the elastic was a little bit too far this way or down towards the actual stitch, but overall, it's pretty good. So yeah, breaking up the process into 2 steps if you don't have an elastic foot is a good thing to do. So now I'm going to demonstrate how to sew elastic with a regular sewing machine. So as far as the process goes, I'm going to do a lot of the same things that I do anyways. So here I have a triangle bikini top. This is the free Dallas top pattern. And I'm going to sew this with a regular sewing machine. So first, before I even deal with elastic, I'm going to do a basting stitch just to make sure that everything is lining up, and that way I can just focus on one thing at a time. So I'm going to increase my stitch length all the way. I'm just doing a straight stitch. Okay, so the basting stitch has been done, and now I'm going to add my elastic. So I'm going to switch over to a zigzag stitch. Going to put my elastic down. I like to leave extra room, helps things not get sucked down. Going to backstitch. Then I'm going to reach my hand back here, grab this excess elastic, and just help it get through that initial seam. And back stitch again. And here is how it turned out. Definitely not perfect. I've done better elastic before, but it can be done. So I'm gonna go ahead and add elastic to the other side. And so here is what it looks like with the elastic on. The process is exactly the same. You're just using a different machine. However, I will say that the serger is much faster, much cleaner look. Overall, if you can use a serger, then you should. However, if you're in a pinch or you're not sure that you want to really commit to swimwear, then a sewing machine is just fine. Just use a zigzag stitch and be prepared to try really hard. So this is what it looks like from the inside out, and I'm gonna flip it. And there you are. It's still laying flat, it still is fine. The serger is faster and it looks prettier, but whether you're using a regular sewing machine or a serger, the same tips apply. You're going to have it be a lot harder on a regular sewing machine, but it's definitely not impossible. So that wraps up part 2. Come back to part 3, where I'm gonna be going over troubleshooting. And we're gonna talk about how to solve specific issues that you might be having. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.